Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of The Fabulous New. I'm your host, Matthew Waller, and today I will be reviewing Steve Roden's Forms of Paper Remastered, released in 2011 online. I'm going to begin by explaining that the reason I'm doing the remastered version of this album was because the original 2001 recording wound up having sounds and qualities that Steve Roden himself said he did not particularly care for, so this is the remastered version that was done in 2011 by Bernhard Günther. Steve Roden is an artist who is living in Pasadena, but most of his work is based in LA. The guy does visual and sound art, he does drawings, paintings, sculptures, film and video, sound installations, performances, text. The guy does basically everything. He's been exhibiting his work in galleries, art spaces, and experimental music festivals since the 1980s, and since '82, he's had dozens of CD releases. Many of his works are based in sound that is inspired by objects or architectural spaces, sometimes field recordings, and he uses very simple electronic processes to do this. On his website, he describes these as possible landscapes. So this album, Forms of Paper, was first recorded in 2001. It was part of a group exhibition called 6 Degrees Art in the Libraries, in which site-specific works were created for public libraries located around the LA area. Steve Roden was one of these artists chosen to be in this group exhibition. For his project, he recorded the sounds of book pages being rubbed together and scraped and turned and manipulated with nothing but a contact mic and a regular mic. And that's it. It's 53 minutes and 59 seconds, so let's call it 54 minutes of just that. Which sounds like it would be really uninteresting, but it's not. It's pretty intriguing, and I'm going to get to that why that is in a second. The music itself is a really big turning point for Roden in his career. He began using Pro Tools with this album. At the time, his Foster 8-track was broken, and he didn't want to have to go purchase a new one and have to wait, so he just got Pro Tools and started recording using that software. He said at the time he only had a rudimentary knowledge of Pro Tools, and even to this day, he still only has a rudimentary knowledge, but he's recorded a lot more albums than a lot of other people I've heard of, so clearly it's working for him. The project was first presented at a Hollywood branch of the LA Libraries, and it was presented in a very interesting way. Roden took a coffee table and put it in the atrium of the library, and he covered it with these folded pages of discarded science books into which he punched these small squares small holes with a hole punch in them. Then the album was played through speakers placed on top of that coffee table in the library atrium for 1 month straight, at a soft enough volume that it did not disturb the patrons. A kind of funny detail is that an anonymous contributor placed a small Chinese electronic toy on a nearby bookshelf that made these cricket sounds, which seems kind of odd, but when you think about crickets as being used as a way to indicate awkward silences, it seems like there's something kind of funny there. There is some meat to that idea. That all being said, here's what the listening experience was like. It was the strangest thing I've ever heard. Prior to listening to this album, I had been listening to a bunch of heavy metal on my headphones, so I had the volume at about 50% because I didn't want to give myself tinnitus. So when I put on Roden's album, I couldn't hear it initially. I thought that the first few minutes were silence, and it wasn't until I jacked up the volume on my headphones that I could actually hear it, so I had to start the album over. The album's been edited through Pro Tools, so it doesn't sound like a bunch of book pages being mixed around. Had I not known that, I probably wouldn't have been able to tell that's what they were by the recording. It actually has a lot of these weird whirring, humming, sonar-like tapping, crackling, crinkling, beeping, humming, crumpling sounds that start off very, very quiet but become far more audible about 2.5 minutes into the recording. Listening to music like this is a bit of a challenge. It defines any sense of harmony or melody or instrumentation. There are some rhythmic elements, there's a bit of a pulse that comes in and out, but it never really feels like a beat. Sounds will enter and exit in such an easy, clean, smooth way that they seem to blend. You'll be listening to a certain sonic quality of the album, and it will just decrease in volume, and another part will increase, and you barely even notice it. It took a few listens for me to begin to notice these tiny little textures. And as a whole, I think this album is far more rich in dynamics than most other recordings in any other genre that I've ever heard. There's no direction, but it never feels just like noise. It's music that exists in the moment. Another thing that was really eerie is because it has all these weird, unusual, quiet sounds. So for a while, I was walking around my living room trying to make sure that my fan was off, or trying to figure out that if sounds I was hearing were part of the recording, or if it was just the wind outside of my window, or the sounds of people in the apartments talking, and their echoes of their voices bouncing off the buildings. There was a point where I was hearing this really unusual noise, and I realized it was my own body. I was moving around, adjusting my weight on the couch, and I couldn't tell for a moment if that was part of the recording or if it wasn't. I've never listened to a piece of music that has made me so aware of not just my own body, but its physical presence in the environment. It's very easy to forget that one is listening to something like this. Your mind can wander very easily, but at the same time, it's not that it isn't interesting. It's music that works with the environment rather than trying to pull you out of the environment and draw you into the piece itself. There's also this moment of absolute silence it's a few seconds long, at about 43 minutes in, and it creates this kind of false conclusion, which does a really good job of breaking up the music. Something like this could easily become very monotonous and forgettable, and even just a simple choice like that really helps to avoid that issue. So the question here is, how does one interpret this album? It took me a long time to be able to figure this out, or to be able to come up with any kind of logical conclusion to what my listening experience was. I had to listen to the album a bunch of times, I had to do a lot of research, and there were a few things that I found that were particularly interesting. One is that this is the first album that was ever considered lowercase music. What's interesting is that Roden never intended lowercase as a term for a specific genre of music. He has claimed that he's been using that term since the 1980s, and it was a reaction against the very bright, loud, bombastic work of painters and sculptors like Julian Schnabel. Work that's interesting and good, but is really... It very clearly demands attention from the audience. It really pulls you in. Very large canvases, usually very odd color schemes. A lot of jarring qualities about it. Roden went for a complete opposite. This is very extreme, ambient, minimalistic work, often using unheard sounds. A lot of the times his work has been unaltered, though with this particular album, the use of Pro Tools allowed him to alter these sounds, which I think was a pretty good choice. He wanted to focus on silence and humility over the spectacle of artwork in the 1980s. Roden first used this term in print with an interview he did in The Wire magazine back in 1997, and then in 2001 he used lowercase to describe this album, and that was when lowercase music entered the lexicon, and people began to mimic his work. Because he has so many problems with the use of lowercase as a music genre, which I personally do not have, I think it's a really accurate term for what he's doing, there's something very poetic and fun about it, I think it might be easier to understand what kind of music this is by looking at it through other artistic lenses. One way that I examined this was to look at minimalist art. I will say I'm a layman when it comes to visual arts, so it's hard for me to talk about visual artistic styles with any degree of detail, so I've got a few articles that I used for research linked at the description of this page. Feel free to go on those. If you see anything that I've missed, if you hear anything that I said that you thought was inaccurate, please tell me, because I would like to learn more about a genre of art that I'm finding more and more that I really enjoy. Minimalism began in the early 1960s in New York City as this reaction against abstract expressionism for being what it was, which these artists deemed as too expressionistic. Think Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, very big canvases, lots of bright colors, lots of intense colors, colors that were jarring at times, colors that meshed quite well. It was work that was known for being so abstruse that the only people who could seem to say anything meaningful about it were the artists themselves, which is why a lot of these abstract expressionist types got known for as being these kind of pretentious, drunken, self-involved men, and why guys like Andy Warhol and the pop art movement really came in and tried to destroy what they had done before, or at least create something that was antithetical to the abstract expressionists. Minimalists favored really simple industrial and fabricated materials. A lot of their sculptures were based in simple pieces of metal, big rectangles or squares, lined up in very even patterns. Paintings could be things like an entire canvas painted in one shade of color, or maybe a dot painted in the middle of the piece. It was the idea of taking the least expressive means you could to make a piece of art. By doing this, they wound up with art that was extremely anonymous versus expressionistic. Its look was very sleek and sterile and cool and glacial, and composed of these repeating simple geometric patterns. When you apply this to music, you see artists like Philip Glass and Steve Reich, assuming I'm saying his name right. I'm not good with German pronunciations. Philip Glass is someone who, although he's expressionistic in his work, he can be very melancholic and beautiful. He creates these very simple arpeggios that will repeat over and over and over and over. They're relaxing, they draw you in, they're very emotional, but they almost feel like bricks of information stacked one on top of the other. In a similar way, Steve Reich uses a lot of these very interesting polyrhythmic pulses in his work, which, again, can be very fun to listen to, but they also have that very repetitive quality. Again, a repetition over emotional expressivity. By the later 1960s, minimalist ideas were adopted by a lot of different people with different ways of looking at the subject, and we had the post-minimalist era, so a breakdown of minimalist concepts. This is where you started seeing more experimental work like body art or land art or site-specific art, of which Roden's work certainly is, conceptualist art. It was art that, rather than using industrial materials, sought to use materials that were less composed or rigid or structurally sound, favoring materials instead which sagged or drooped or in some way showed the process of creation. Think the sculptures of Eva Hesse. They're beautiful, they're minimal, but they use a lot of these very simple, very easy to manipulate materials that seem to have a lot more character. They're softer, thread, sheets, things that have a bit of a warmth and a heart to them. Roden's art, in this sense, is sound art, or lowercase music, or forms of paper, the album itself. It's the sound of post-minimalist composition. This is Philip Glass 2.0 for a later era. In another sense, I can kind of think of Roden's work as almost like industrial music. Industrial music is said to have started in 1979 with Throbbing Gristle's first album. You had groups like Eidenstern's and Neubauten, Front 242, Frontline Assembly, that were using weird static and noise and these very repetitive rhythms that were created by banging pieces of metal together. And then, by the later 80s, you start seeing groups like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, and that really exploded into the 90s with the whole industrial rock and industrial metal scenes. Roden's work is similar to this, but in a different light. He's still going for a process of creation that you can really truly hear and latch onto, but the aggression is no longer there. This all leads to the big question: is this even music? The YouTube channel This Exists did a video tackling this exact subject a few years ago. It's how I was introduced to Roden's work. And they discussed the idea that music is simply the organization of sound, even if it's silence. John Cage's 433 is a good example of that. It's a piece of music that is complete silence throughout. Miles Davis actually said that he focused more on silence than he actually did the notes that he was playing. This, however, leads to the poetry problem. When someone reads a piece of poetry, it's sound, it has a nice quality, it's organized sound to the organization of words, but we wouldn't call that music per se. It's the reading of text. It's a different art form in and of itself. Roden does not actually refer to himself on his website as a musician at all. He says that he makes sound art, installation art, he even calls his work sound, but he never describes it as music. However, he plays at experimental music festivals. And this made me realize think about something I had heard years ago. The philosopher Roland Barthes had this idea, the death of author, which meant that a text, which in this case could be any piece of art because you as the reader are reading the text and interpreting the art, a text should not be interpreted with the author's intentions or autobiographical context in mind. The reason being, you can't truly know what an author intended with his or her work. By extension, the reader of a text, the audience member engaging with the piece of art, is constructing the meaning of the art through their own exegesis. In other words, the baggage you bring when you look or listen or in any way, shape, or form engage with a piece of art is more important, or at the very least as important, as the intentions of the artist. I think there's gray area for this. I think there are definitely times where you need to consider artistic intention. But this idea does seem to have a grain of salt to it. That being said, does it matter if Roden doesn't think of his work as music? If I think of his work as music, is that enough for me to call this music? I feel like it presents a kind of tautology that I might not be equipped enough to get myself out of, but it's a topic that I did want to bring up in this review. This being said, here are my final thoughts on the album. I've never ever listened to anything that is this challenging in my life. There's all this talk about listening to a lot of avant-garde material, a lot of noise music, some of the free jazz stuff that you'll hear, a lot of contemporary classical music, but I've never listened to something which is so demanding of my time and yet so willing to work with me. It's hard for me to even talk about. It's work that seems to defy semantics. I liked it. It definitely put me out of my comfort zone. I definitely learned more about music and what music can be. It changed a lot of my preconceptions of how to think about sound and art in relation to one another as a whole. I would love to hear more lowercase music, not just by Roden, but by guys like Bernhard Günther or Richard Chartier, other people who I've stumbled on who work within Roden's lowercase-esque genre. Which, again, he doesn't want to think of as a genre. The term's already out there. We're never getting rid of it. That being said, I would like to hear a lot of his techniques incorporated into other kinds of music, even popular music. Much in the way that Trent Reznor and a lot of those late 80s, early 90s industrial rock metal acts took those ideas of Throbbing Gristle and Einsters and Neubauten and applied contemporary pop formats to them, thereby bringing those styles to a mainstream audience. I think a lot of indie rock or folk-sounding stuff could incorporate these elements quite well. I think it would work best in the cloud rap subgenre. There's that kind of soporific haze that goes with that contemporary kind of hip-hop that we've been hearing a lot of lately. I think you take a Roden sample and you decide to stick a beat on it, or even if you don't, you're just, reading some good poetry, you could make something quite interesting out of that. I definitely want to see more of Roden's work in person. I've got his website linked in the description. I think his sculptures look absolutely incredible, and I guess he often pairs his sound installation pieces with his sculptures, so I feel like I can't just look at them. I really do need to be in the environment to engage with them. So if I ever get a shot at going to LACMA anytime soon, I hope he's got some work there, because I think that'd be really fun to see. Again, good album. I think everyone should listen to it once. I think there's a lot more there than there appears to be, and my next review is going to be a jazz album. I'm actually going to be going to a jazz band. I'm not going to say who, but they're playing at Summerfest in Milwaukee. I've never been to Summerfest. I'm going to see a jazz concert. I haven't seen a jazz concert since I got to see Donnie McCaslin at the Green Mill in Chicago. Yeah, I'm very much excited about going, and it's going to be an album that I think is a little bit easier for me to talk about. So, that being said, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me your thoughts, feelings, and opinions on these, because on the subject at hand, because I would definitely like to hear it. If you'd like to support me on Patreon and see more of these videos, please do so. Again, check out those description, or the links I have in the description. I think they'll really help add a lot more context to interpreting Roden's work. And that being said, thank you so much for spending some time in the Fabulous New.